Hello, welcome to a new video. Yes, it's a new one. This is going to be a new part of series. This isn't necessarily related to the history of. This is its kind of own thing. This is going to be called the Textile Files.
Oh, brother, this
Please tell me you
guy
get it.
stinks!
Files. Yeah. So this is going to be like a series of kind of exploring weird artifacts within history that have some sort of like textile thing. I don't know. But yeah, how is everyone? Are you okay? Have you got that project finished? I've not. I've been working on the same thing for about 2 months now and it's driving me crazy. And I don't want to cast on anything else because I can't be arsed. I need to get this finished. And it's like a polo collar. I've never done a polo collar before and it's actually driving me insane. I had to frog it like 3 times, but we're almost done now. So I'm putting all my focus into that. Yeah, I went on a tangent, but today we're going to be talking about the one, the only, the Shroud of Turin. And if you're new here, I'm Matt, I'm sad knitting. This is my own little, this is my area of sadness. No, it's not, that's a lie. This is my little corner of the internet where I talk about the weird, the strange, the creepy, and I try and always relate it back to kind of some sort of fiber arts, knitting kind of thing. Sometimes very loosely, sometimes about as loose as Tom Daly's flows. Ayo! Sorry. But yeah, let's get into the video. So today we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin, which is one of my favourite objects ever. Not because I'm religious, but because it looks really cool. It looks so cool, like, gag. So we're going to be deep diving into the Shroud, okay? I have written a script, but it's shit, so I'm just going to riff it. So if I get anything wrong, I'm sorry. I'm not a historian and I'm really bad at researching. So just be with me here. I like it because it's cool and it's somewhat fiber arts related. It was woven, okay? So get with the program. So we're going to start with history. So for centuries, the Shroud has been at the centre of major debate on whether it's authentic or not. If you don't know what the Shroud of Turin is, it's basically a long piece of linen that contains an image of a man that people believe is Jesus Christ. Some people believe it's a painting, some people believe it's just a medieval forgery, and science doesn't really know. Anyway, I'm not here to debunk this. I'm not here to say it's not real or it's real. That's not my thing. I don't care either way if it's real or not. I just like it. I think it's cool. So I'm not religious anyway. So although when I am manic, I do get very into religious studies and I don't know why. Maybe there's something in that, but I'm not going to go into that. Yeah, so it's supposedly the most studied artifact in history, which I don't necessarily believe because I feel like there's a lot of things that probably have been studied more, like the Mona Lisa, but that's not for me to say. But yeah, so where does the story of the Shroud of Turin actually originate? And honestly, we don't know. Historians and scientists seem to think that the first kind of date that they can kind of stick onto the shroud was in 1350. That is like the first confirmed date we can kind of say for certain that it's the first mentioned historical text of the shroud, and it was by a knight called Geoffrey de Charnay. I'm not French. Yeah, it's thought that he acquired the shroud from Constantinople during the Holy Wars. He came back and wrote a letter to the Pope at the time, basically saying that he wants to build a church and dedicate it to the Holy Trinity because he prayed for safe return, and he obviously returned, and he comes back with the shroud, and the shroud is then kept in the church he made. I think it was called this Church of Saint something. I'll put it up here, and there it was basically displayed there for years and years and years until 1355, so about 5 years later. The bishop at the time basically was like, that's not real, get it the fuck out of here. So it was removed and it was kind of hidden away for a bit, and this is where it gets a bit complicated because it basically just gets passed around. Like, it gets passed around like me at a party. That's a joke. During this time, people don't necessarily know where it went, as it's treated as something that's extremely valuable, which it kind of is, and it's mainly only used like and displayed for kind of people of a certain class, like very wealthy people, special families. So during big ceremonies such as weddings, coronations, things like that, that is when the shroud was kind of brought out. And this is where we can kind of see the shroud becoming not just a artifact of history, but a kind of political tool that people will be using to be like, I'll let you see the shroud if you marry my daughter, or something along those lines. Like, it becomes a political artifact as well as a religious one. And in 1453, the shroud was acquired by the Savoy family. They were pretty much the Italian royal family until about 1946. And they put the shroud inside a chapel in Chardonnay, and this was kept in an ornate container. And then throughout the years in the 1500s, it was again brought out for a few different events, such as royal family birthdays, coronations, etc. And there's a story here that I found which is kind of interesting. So the shroud was brought out for display for a special person, and one of the courtiers there mentioned that the shroud has actually been tried by fire, water, and I'll read you the quote now. So, the shroud's authenticity had been confirmed by it having been tried by fire, boiled in oil, laundered many times, but it was not possible to efface or remove the imprint and image. Which, that is quite interesting considering what happens next, but no spoilers. In December the 4th, 1532, disaster struck when a fire broke out. So because the shroud was encased in this ornate big box basically, and it was locked up pretty tight, that they couldn't get it out. They had to get a blacksmith to come in and then just like rip the locks off basically, because they wanted to try and save it. And they did save it, although the shroud was a little bit scorched and it had a lot of holes. Metal of the actual frame melted and put holes in it, which you can still see. And in April 1534, they had repairs on the actual shroud by using pieces of Holland fabric where they kind of sewed into the holes to try and keep it pretty, which will also come up later again. And this is where, again, the shroud starts to move. It just dips in and out of history. People are moving it around, and it finally arrives in Turin on the 14th of September 1578, where during this period we see the shroud starting to get more of a public showing. At one point, over 40,000 people came to Turin to see the shroud, which is insane. And since 1683, the shroud has been kept in the chapel of the Holy Shroud, which was purposely designed to connect the royal palace with the cathedral. And during the First World War, for example, the palace actually had a secret underground chamber constructed 2 floors below ground level. So I'll read you this quote. Alarmed by the danger of air raids from the World War then raging, King Victor Emmanuel III orders the shroud to be put in a place of safety, on condition that it does not leave the royal palace. A secret underground chamber is specially constructed 2 floors below ground level in the southeast side of Turin's royal palace, with not even the contractors told of its purpose. On the floor of this chamber is set a large strong box with a complex combination lock. On 6th of May, the casket of the shroud is removed from the royal chamber in which it had laid undisturbed since 1898. It is wrapped in a thick blanket of asbestos, put in the chest made of tin plate, hermetically sealed with cold solder, then carried down to the secret chamber, where it is solemnly locked inside the strong box. Prayers are recited, after which the chamber's heavy entrance doors are locked. And I find it really interesting that some of the ways they actually displayed the shroud actually probably made it degrade further, because there were some instances where they would hang the shroud from like the balcony gag. And then there was one period where the Pope at the time, this was in 1804, Pope Pius VII, I think it was, who was on his way to crown Napoleon. He went to visit the shroud and then like examined it and then started kissing it everywhere. Like, bro, you're gonna get your germs on it. You were literally gonna fucking, like, you don't know where that's been either. Honestly. And this was witnessed by like 7 bishops and nobody said anything. Yeah, so now we're in the age of science. And the shroud had always had its authenticity questioned but there was no kind of way to prove it. It was just kind of like hearsay. And even to this day, there's no way we're ever going to figure out if it was actually Jesus. So in 1898, a French photographer went to Turin to actually photograph the Shroud of Turin. And he photographed it, everything was fine, and he didn't think much of it. He was just happy to actually take a photo of it. And it wasn't until he actually developed the film of the actual photo that he saw, I say film, it probably wasn't film, it was probably on a plate. And yeah, so when he went to go actually develop it, he realized the shroud is so much clearer as a negative than it is in real life. So here is the negative. Boom. It looks stunning. It looks so cool. This could be a rock album. So this kind of deepens the whole mystery of the shroud. Like, why is it that it appears so much clearer as a negative than it does in real life? And this kind of reignited the fascination with the shroud. I'd say during the mid-50s, 1950s to 1960s and 70s, this is where a group of scientists come into the picture. In 1968, a group of scientists actually traveled to Turin to actually observe and scientifically study the shroud. And this was the first time any sort of scientific study had actually been done on the shroud. And they weren't allowed to kind of do any kind of forensic testing. And they basically were only allowed to photograph it and kind of stare at it, basically. They weren't allowed to do anything. Although this did mean that they could photograph it in detail. So this was like the first time we got a full color image of the shroud, which is pretty dope. And in the late 1970s, we get further scientific investigations because an international group of scientists, they all go to Turin to actually study the shroud. And this was direct testing. This wasn't just like looking at it. This was scientific tests. They went with a lab kit. They were doing everything. And most of the scientists were formed of a group of American scientists that called themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project, also known as STIR. And this isn't related in the slightest, but I find it really interesting. So when I was actually looking at the scientists that studied the shroud, so this is a group of scientists called STIR, as I just said, and they studied the shroud for about 2 years beforehand to kind of prepare all of these tests. Most of these scientists come from Los Alamos National Labs and the Jet Propulsion Lab. And I'm not saying there's a connection, but I find it really weird how all of these scientists have a history of weapons testing. And if you didn't know, Los Alamos Laboratory has lots of connections with UFOs and aliens, and even the Jet Propulsion Lab as well, that has some connections. So I'm not saying aliens, but anyway, back onto it. Yeah, so in 1978, this group of scientists were allowed into the chapel to examine shroud, and they did not have a lot of time. I think they had about 3 to 5 days to actually do all of their tests. So they spent about 120 hours straight. Like, they slept in shifts. They did not waste a second because they were like, this may be the only time we can actually scientifically observe this object. And they did chemical testing, they did UV testing, they did X-ray testing, they did chemical reaction testing. Because they actually couldn't take any samples because they weren't allowed to damage the shroud, they came up with this idea of laying sellotape or sticky tape or something similar on top of the surface of the shroud and then taking it off. So they basically were examining the fibers and the material on top of the actual shroud itself, so they didn't damage any of the fibers or the shroud. And it wasn't just to determine like if it's authentic, but they wanted to see what the actual shroud is, what's physically in the shroud, what are the fibers made from, what is the chemical composition of some of the stains, for example. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what the scientists actually tested. So firstly, they wanted to do a light-based analysis using infrared and ultraviolet light because they wanted to see if the material had any kind of hidden secrets, basically. The reason why infrared is so important is because every material interacts differently with infrared. For example, paint. If the shroud was painted, then the infrared would absorb and interact very differently with under infrared light. And as well as burn signatures, they have a very distinct signature that the scientists would be able to identify. So if the shroud is actually made up of something, they could detect it. So firstly, they use something called infrared reflective. They use something called infrared reflectance infrared reflectance spectroscopy. I'm not saying it, it's there. This measures how much infrared light bounces off the surface of the shroud. And they did this because different chemicals actually give off a different reflective curve. So this was kind of like identifying a substance by using like a light fingerprint, basically. This, however, did not go well because the shroud itself actually gave off very little infrared light, and the signals that they did get were inconsistent and not very great. And a lot of environmental factors added lots of noise to the data, so it just wasn't a great data source. So they couldn't get like a good conclusion from the light testing. However, they did manage to find out that there was no real clear evidence that there was any added pigment to the cloth. So it kind of does, not for certain, it doesn't 100% dismiss the idea that the shroud was painted, but it also says that there was no evidence to say it was. So now we get into the strongest and most detailed findings of the shroud. So now they use tape to microscopically lift material from the shroud. They did this to pick up linen fibers, dust, and any other particles that were on the surface of the shroud. They were analysed under a microscope and then chemically tested. And the findings of this test were a lot better because they didn't find any pigments. So that also kind of ruled out that the shroud was painted. There was no pigments to confirm that. And they also discovered that there was no layered application. So if it was painted, it was all flat. One of the most surprising findings is when they examined the fibers, they found that the image itself is only on the top of the fibers. It's like if you toast a bread very lightly and the top is just on the top and it doesn't affect any of the inside. That's how crazy. That's mad. It's also discovered a lot of chemical changes within the linen itself. This is what kind of explains the yellowy tones of the shroud. This also kind of deepens the mystery of the shroud because it kind of shows how hard it is to actually create the shroud, because the image itself is only surface level and it shows there's an even distribution across the body shape, no liquid penetration and no directional application. So it's very strange. Okay, now we're going to be talking about the blood chemistry. Like, is the stains on the shroud actually blood? This is my favorite part. So in order to test the stains to find out if it was blood or not, the scientists test a few things. They tested the iron content, they tested for components of hemoglobin, which is in blood, any protein residues that may kind of exist on the fibers. But what did they find? Did they find blood? Spectral analysis is consistent with hemoglobin, and the iron levels of the stains they do match biological material, and the chemical reactions are typical of blood compounds. And not just that, they also analysed how the stains formed and how they flowed on the material itself. So they looked at the stains and analysed the look and behaviour of the stains. They noticed that it was denser in the centre regions of the body, and they also found that there was evidence of fluid separation, which does match how blood dries. And not only did they measure the blood, but they also looked at the shroud they also looked at the shroud within a anatomical way. So they basically looked at the figure in the shroud and said, okay, if this was a real body, if it was a person that was crucified, does all the stains match up? And what did they find? So firstly, they did deduce that the stains do align with the human form. So they measured the wrist and arm flow patterns, the side wounds, and the numerous small marks across the body. And they also found that some marks actually repeat themselves, which they think was consistent of injury patterns. But it's important to note here though that like it's consistent, like all of this evidence, you know, for example, like the blood, they say it's consistent of blood, but they don't 100% say this is blood because they can't for 100% prove it. One of the most important things they did find is that the image doesn't actually exist beneath the bloodstains. And this kind of suggests that the linen itself was already covered in blood and then the body was made contact with the linen. So what did the researchers actually come to the conclusion of? The researchers were pretty confident in saying that they could never prove that this was Jesus Christ. Like it would be impossible to actually prove it was Jesus. Like they never set out to prove that it was Jesus. They were just basically like, we want to find out what it is because it's interesting. And across all of these tests, they were very confident in rejecting that it was one, a traditional painting, two, it was like dyed, or three, that it was just like a burn mark. But again, rejecting it isn't the same as proving it. So, and kind of like after all this testing, we can kind of gather that the image is real. It's not a stain. It's not a painting. And the stains all appear to behave like blood. So that was in the 1970s, and the mystery is still kind of here. There's no kind of resolution of it. So what has happened since the 1970s? Has there been any other scientific investigations of the shroud? And the answer is yes. So one of the most important scientific discoveries, we could say, or advancements, was in 1988, three institutions, I think it was the University of Oxford, University of Arizona, and the Swiss Institute of Technology. So they all went to the church and asked permission to radiocarbon date the shroud. And this has been quite controversial because they took samples from one of the corners of the shroud, and they said with 95% confident that the age rate dates from about 1200 to 1300 AD, which does kind of line up with when the shroud started to come into historical text. So it does look like it is from a medieval period. However, a lot of people have criticized it, saying that they could have just analyzed a repair from the medieval period, and it doesn't necessarily prove that it's from the medieval period. So again, all of these tests, they're just not really giving us any answers. They did retest it in 2020 to try and see if the technology has advanced enough to kind of give a real date. And they decided that they could kind of move the date by a decade or so, but it's still within that medieval period. So it's, you know, nothing really came out of that. Another interesting test that happened in 2015 by an Italian scientist was that they analysed DNA that was picked up from the dust that the scientists in the 70s collected, and they found a whole bunch of DNA within the dust. So they found plant DNA, human DNA, and the most interesting thing was some of the plant DNA that they found are species native of the Mediterranean. So that does kind of geologically put it in the kind of area of Jesus. The DNA profile that they found was mitochondrial. I don't know if I said that right, but this kind of DNA type represents a wide range of ethnic and geological backgrounds. So like Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, like, so it's really hard to kind of pinpoint where it's actually come from. And skeptics again said that all of this DNA and all of these kind of materials that have been found on the shroud are just evidence of all of the places and people the shroud has interacted with over the years, and it doesn't necessarily rule out that it was from that period, that geological place. And while they are consistent with where the shroud was thought to originate, it doesn't necessarily confirm or deny that it's from the medieval period, like the radiocarbon dating says. So again, it's just all up in the air. So now we're going to get a bit artsy, because why not? So over the years, so many people have tried to recreate the shroud to kind of prove how it was done. A lot of people, so I'm going to go through some of them, because some of them are really interesting. So some of the ones that I'm going to talk through now, some of them, basically all of them have been successful at recreating some parts of the shroud, but none of them have been successful in recreating all of it. So firstly, a chemist in 2009 decided to create a full-size replica of the shroud using materials and techniques only found in the Middle Ages, not the Middle Ages, the medieval period. So what he did is he placed the linen shroud over like a human subject and started to rub a acidic pigment. He then artificially aged the cloth to kind of get that aged look about it. And it resembled the shroud in some ways, but it didn't have the same dimensions and it didn't have the same uniformity and key details in terms of like the face and the structure that the shroud has. So, bit of a fail. Most of the kind of recreations were some kind of transfer method. So it would either be dust or some sort of pigment that they tried to kind of rub onto the shroud from a person. And the dust type technique basically involved rubbing a pigment on a prepared surface and then placing the linen on top of the surface. And this produces a kind of silhouette of a person, and it still has that kind of uniform shape that the shroud has. Scientists also tried to do a chemical reaction type test to recreate it. Apparently this is known as the Maillard reaction. So this is a type of browning that happens when sugars react with amino acids. And their kind of idea was that a dead body could kind of produce gases that would kind of mix in with the linen, I guess. Yeah, this kind of fell apart because there was no clear evidence that the body under the shroud was rotting when the shroud was formed. One test I do think is interesting to know is that in 2020 they decided to examine the weaving pattern of the shroud, and the shroud is woven using something called a herringbone weave. A weaver called Antoinette Marion Olson, and she basically tried to replicate the actual shroud by using the type of weave they should have used during that period. And she came to the conclusion that if they were to make this now, they would need to use something called a treadle loom. So that is kind of the conclusion that came from that. The shroud must have been made on a treadle loom. But to conclude, there's not really a defining scientific conclusion of the shroud. There's so many tests that have been done on it, and it is one of them objects where there is no possible scientific way we can prove that it comes from Jesus Christ or that it is Jesus Christ. One of my favorite theories of the shroud, because there's loads, is that the actual form, the human form on the shroud, came from some sort of radiation from when Jesus Christ was resurrected, and like the light from his soul kind of imprinted on the shroud, which I think that's cool. But yeah, to conclude, there's not really, it's still an unknown. It's super unknown, and unless there's some sort of technology that comes about where we can study it further without breaking it or ripping it, then I guess this is one that's just going to never be solved. And I think that's fine. I don't necessarily feel like it needs to have a definite answer. I think the shroud itself has become a symbol of God, Christian, religious iconography, all that. So, just let them have it. I don't know, it's not bothering anyone. I personally don't care either way if it's real or not. It's still fascinating. It's still, it's a piece of art, it's a piece of history, it's a piece of science now. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see what everyone else thinks. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on the shroud. Have you seen it in real life? Have you been to the museum? I want to go to the museum, but I'm poor. And do you think it's real or not? Do you think it's actually Jesus Christ? Do you think it's some randomer that they just kind of did and were like, you look like Jesus, let's do you. That'd be so funny if that was real. But yeah, let me know in the comments. I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts and theories. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. I read so much scientific articles for this and I don't understand any of it, so don't at me at the comments being like, you don't know anything. Like, I'm a knitter, I'm not a scientist or a historian. I'm just doing this for bands because I've got no friends. But anyway, if you made it to the end of this video, comment yarn ball and I'll thank you because you're the most valuable players in this game. If you have any video suggestions on anything creepy or somewhat yarn fiber arts related, please put them in the comments because I am struggling to find subjects and I'm trying to relate them to yarn and it's very hard to do so. So if you've got any suggestions, please put them in the comments. If you want to support me even further, go and follow me on Instagram and TikTok, and you can even follow me on LinkedIn if you want. I don't know, but yeah, you could also buy me a coffee to support my attempt to become a YouTuber, I guess. But yeah, I'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye.